Practice Test 4, page 137. Section 1. Summarize spoken text. You will hear a short lecture. Write a summary for a fellow student who was not present at the lecture. You should write 50 to 70 words. You will have 10 minutes to finish this task. Your response will be judged on the quality of your writing and on how well your response presents the key points presented in the lecture. Lecture A.
Is it true you once said that English as a subject at university, literature I mean, was a soft option? That it was just doing what you enjoy doing anyway? That is, reading books,
No, I didn't. In fact, I was arguing, and on occasion still have to argue, the opposite. This goes back to the very beginning of English as an academic subject. There was a demand for it, but the universities themselves didn't take it seriously as an academic discipline. So, to cut a long story short, they would only accept its place in the curriculum if it was made more difficult. What I said was that too many people do think of it as a soft option. If you want to find out just how rigorous a course it can be, ask any of my students. If you were to try to read the books on the list for one semester as a leisure activity, you wouldn't get through them, let alone reading them with the proper attention, and then having to come up with a suitable and well-thought-out critical response. And it's not just about the set books. There's the whole cultural context to take into account.
Lecture B.
I became interested in, what would you call it, the behaviour, the psychology, perhaps, of crowds after getting caught up, quite by accident, in a demonstration that turned into a bit of a riot. You may have seen it on the news not long ago. What interested me was, first, my own reactions to the way the whole mood changed from peaceful demonstration to violence. Secondly, I wondered if everyone else was feeling the same as I was, and what that said about us and how we behave in crowds. Why is it that perfectly ordinary, respectable members of the public can start behaving in ways they wouldn't dream of doing when at home or among friends? A crowd, it seems to me, has a collective mind. Each person there adds his or her mind to the collective mind and willingly gives up all sense of judgment and responsibility. It gives you, I suppose, a feeling of freedom, of not having to be in control. It allows you the freedom, or you allow yourself the freedom, to behave in ways that, if asked, you would say were against your principles, or made you feel guilty in some way, even criminal.
Lecture C.
John Milton is best known for his poetry, especially Paradise Lost, but also for the more accessible and shorter Lycidas and L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, plus one or two sonnets you'll find in most anthologies. But an easier way into what he thought and believed in social and political terms is through his prose writings. These were mostly pamphlets and tracts written in reaction to some political event or situation, but also included pamphlets on a wide variety of subjects, including at least 4 on divorce, which for him was tied up with personal freedom. However, the text which has probably had the most relevance down the years, and which can still be read with profit, is the Areopagitica, which is a defence of freedom of expression and publication, and against censorship. It was written as a reaction to an attack on himself in particular a pamphlet on divorce he had written, and which some condemned as a wicked book.
Practice Test 4, page 138, section 2. Multiple choice. Choose multiple answers. Listen to the recording and answer the question by selecting all the correct responses. You will need to select more than one response. Recording A.
Noises are defined as disagreeable sounds, but this suggests that they are no more than an annoyance, something to be put up with. There is increasing evidence that noise, on the scale that people who live in big cities have to deal with, is dangerous and can give rise to serious health and social problems, some of which, such as its effects on people's behaviour and anger levels, you might not have thought were caused by noise and are health concerns. There is, of course, the almost constant noise of traffic, though this isn't a particularly modern problem. In ancient Rome, there were rules to minimise the noise made by the iron wheels of wagons, which battered the stones on the pavement, causing disruption of sleep. Traffic noise is one of the health hazards, as it can lead to other problems like noise-induced hearing impairment. It is also highly distracting, interfering with speech communication and leisure time relaxation. And while this doesn't drive you mad in the medical sense, it is intensely annoying and can lead to mental health problems. Also, noise, whether you work in a place where loud machinery is operating or not, can have an effect on performance at work. Though in itself not a health matter, this can lead to other problems.
Recording B.
Yes, it's funny you should mention Merwin. Until about a year ago, I thought England was the only country that had a poet laureate. After all, it's a pretty odd job, isn't it? No salary to speak of and just a barrel of wine or something as payment. But he was, or is, the American poet laureate, isn't he?
That's right, but quite a few other countries have one too.
I know. I looked into it a bit. Other countries in the UK, for a start. Wales, as you'd expect, with their Eisteddfods and long poetic tradition. And Ireland and Scotland. I think some places that were colonies or in the Commonwealth have them. Canada, for example. And who's that wonderful Caribbean poet? The one that wrote Omeros.
Derek Walcott.
That's him. He was the poet laureate of St. Lucia. But what about the rest of Europe? Don't the French have such a thing?
No, I don't think so. They've got the Academy, and you get elected to that if you're considered the best in your field. But I think Germany might have. No, it wasn't Germany. Somewhere else, but I don't remember. By the way, you're a bit behind the times in thinking what they get paid as a barrel of wine. All that changed long ago. But one of the more recent ones asked to have it back.
Recording C.
Readjusting to life in your own country after living abroad for some time is a little like recovering from jet lag after a long flight across several time zones. It takes time. And research indicates that after 9 years of living in a foreign country, you never really do readjust. Of course, things have changed. Governments have come and gone. What you knew as countryside has become a suburb. New technologies have changed the way people go about their daily lives, and so on. These changes may well have been taking place in your adopted country, but they were happening while you were there, so you could adapt as you went along. Those are not the main difficulties, however. It is in the smaller, everyday things that you might experience what is known as culture shock, although it's not really a shock, but puzzling all the same. For example, the precise way to behave at a supermarket checkout may have changed, and in ordinary conversation, the frames of reference have changed, and quite often you find that you don't really know what people are talking about, even though they are speaking your native tongue.
Practice Test 4, page 139. Section 2. Fill in the blanks. You will hear a recording. Write the missing words in each blank. Recording A.
Privacy and the right to privacy are increasingly becoming hot topics in the media, which is a touch ironic given that it is often the media that is responsible for invasion of privacy. This is not just about those whose careers put them in the public eye, but ordinary people who, through no fault of their own, have come to public notice because of some event that has attracted the attention of the media. It might be that a member of their family has been imprisoned for some crime, rightfully or wrongfully, or perhaps they are the victims of some natural disaster. Some people argue that those who have chosen to be in the public sphere and have teams of public relations people to make sure they get as much public attention as possible, actors, rock stars, politicians and the like, have given up their right to privacy and get everything they deserve.
Recording B.
There is such a thing as information overload. There is just so much information out there now that we can't cope with it or fully absorb it, or even decide which bits of it we want to keep in our minds or which to discard. There is a similar thing going on with the range of choices we have as consumers. There is so much stuff out there, so much to choose from that, according to some experts, this situation is making us miserable. Most of us believe that the more we have to choose from, the better. Yet, apparently, our dissatisfaction with this wealth of choice, or rather the anxiety it produces, is part of a larger trend. It seems that as society grows more affluent and people become freer to do what they want, the unhappier they become.
Recording C.
Postmodernism is, broadly speaking, a reaction against the movement or the period, or perhaps simply the values and beliefs of modernism. Most people, even those who seem to know what it is or was about, tend to define it in negative terms by telling us what it isn't or doesn't do. Initially, the term had a fairly limited application and referred to a new anti-modernist style of architecture, but it spread like a virus to include almost all aspects of contemporary culture. One thing we can be sure about is that it wanted to get rid of what were called the grand narratives by which we explained how the world and history got us from the past to the present. Another feature of postmodernism is its belief that truth and reality are human-centred and internal. That is, the primary source of truth in the present age is the self. This, I believe, has now all passed and been thrown in the rubbish bin of history. Yet it is difficult to know whether the age of information technology confirms the passing of postmodernism or is a consequence of it.
Practice Test 4, page 140. Section 2. Highlight correct summary. You will hear a recording. Choose the paragraph that best relates to the recording. Recording A.
I want to take a quick look at how material culture, that is, the things or objects we value and use, tools, technology, etc., affects the non-material culture, our customs, behaviour, beliefs, attitudes, and so on. Now, of course, it works both ways. If you were, say, 18 years old when mobile phones became widespread, or when almost every home had a computer, you must have noticed a fairly significant change in people's attitudes and behaviour, including your own. These two technological innovations were readily accepted and considered very much a positive contribution to culture. On the other hand, there is the way in which our attitudes and beliefs have an effect on the material culture. Take, for example, genetic science. While many, if not most, people welcome the advances made in this field, from the discovery of DNA to the Genome Project and cracking the genetic code, with its promise of finding cures for diseases that have plagued mankind throughout history, many too object to the idea of cloning. This is not just because they fear, without reason, that it will mean creating a race of identical people if it gets into the wrong hands, but simply because it is, in their opinion, unnatural. It goes against everything they believe in. Similarly, there are many who object to genetically modified food, even when they are told it might be the only way to feed a rapidly growing global population.
Recording B.
Ernest Hemingway was famously masculine. We can see this in the topics he wrote about, all those fights and bullfights, all those wars, all that hunting and fishing. All this, it is thought, was overdoing it, and must point to some deep insecurity in the man. Perhaps he felt that the conventional image of a writer, as a person who doesn't do a lot more than sitting at a desk, not visibly contributing much socially or economically to society as a whole, was unmanly and carried a certain amount of guilt and shame with it. During the First World War, he was badly wounded, hospitalised, and fell in love with a nurse. He wrote a novel about a man who was badly wounded in the First World War, was hospitalised, and who fell in love with a nurse. The Spanish Civil War and the Second World War followed, as did books about his experiences in them. Now, how much can we draw on a writer's biography to explain his work? It should, I believe, be irrelevant to the judgment you bring to the merits of the individual work. Biographies of writers can be fascinating, especially if they lived as hard and fast as Hemingway, but unfortunately, these days many people prefer the biography to the actual work. It is odd that the very reason a person would want to read a biography of a writer, that the subject has achieved fame and distinction in his field, should be the excuse for not reading his works.
Practice Test 4, page 141. Section 2. Multiple choice. Choose single answer. Listen to the recording and answer the multiple choice question by selecting the correct response. Only one response is correct. Recording A.
The division of literary works into genres, or texts that deal with a particular subject or a subject in a particular way, makes life easier for the person browsing in a bookshop. He or she can go directly to where their favourite kind of book is shelved, be it science fiction, gothic, romance, and so on. Many writers of genre fiction are immensely popular and successful, Stephen King and J.K. Rowling to name only two. But, for the most part, Such writers aren't depicting the world we live in and are writing fantasies. However, some genre writers, particularly writers of detective and police fiction, are unhappy about being categorized in this way. Genre fiction, they say, has come to be seen as inferior to what is called mainstream or literary fiction. In other words, detective fiction isn't taken seriously as literature, and yet crime novels do deal with the raw stuff of everyday life. They are, in fact, closer to the harsh reality of the modern world than most mainstream fiction. But, the critics say, while they do deal with the usual stuff of novels, character, emotion, psychology, social comment and so on, it seldom goes very deep. And, besides, most detective fiction, like certain mass-produced romantic novels, though not to anywhere near the same extent, follow a formula.
Recording B.
In small doses, stress can have quite a positive effect. It can make you feel more alive, even exhilarated. I suppose everyone has a set level at which stress becomes unbearable, at which point they cease to function properly. I suppose, too, that it's possible for someone to train themselves to be able to take higher levels of stress by repeatedly putting themselves in a stressful situation to build up a tolerance for stress. Indeed, some jobs absolutely require this. But stress is a fact of life for all of us, and, as the figures show, its effect is largely negative. Each year, about 6 million people in Britain consult their doctors because they feel stress or anxiety, and it is estimated that at least another 6 million suffer from stress-related illness but do not seek medical advice. Long working hours, fear of losing their jobs, the difficult journey to and from work in crowded trains and buses all contribute to increased levels of stress. Then there are domestic problems, such as a large mortgage on the house, children who want to drop out of school and join rock bands, not enough time to spare to be with the family.
Recording C.
The nature-nurture debate is still going on. It is not a question of taking sides because we know that both play an important part in what makes us who we are. It is more a question of emphasis. Which of them has the greatest influence? On the nature side, we have what we get from our genes, our inherited traits, eye color and other physical traits, for example, but also, some believe, non-physical ones, such as temperament. For example, you might be quick to anger or have a nervous temperament, and this even extends to sense of humor. On the nurture side, there is what we get from our environment and our upbringing, what we learn. Research into the human genome has recently made it clear that both sides are partly right. Nature gives us inborn abilities and traits, while nurture takes these genetic tendencies and shapes them as we grow and learn and mature. This is an important point, as it means, contrary to the belief of some, that we are not wholly determined by our genes. Scientists have known for years that eye and hair color are determined by specific genes, but some now claim that such traits as intelligence and personality are also encoded in our genes.
Practice Test 4, page 142. Section 2. Select missing word. You will hear a recording about using the library. At the end of the recording, the last word or group of words has been replaced by a beep. Select the correct option to complete the recording. Recording A.
Too many students search for material by going to what they think is the right shelf in the library, finding little or nothing, and then reporting back to their tutor that there's nothing on it in the library. If you have some authors and titles in mind, look them up in the catalogue. They may not be where you think. And look at adjacent entries in the catalogue and on the shelves. The catalogue may lead you to restricted loan collections, reserve stacks, or departmental collections, which may not always be obvious. You should also check the subject catalogue, trying to think of related terms. Other places to look would be the reference shelves and newspaper section, though a problem here is finding
You will hear a recording about the sense of touch. At the end of the recording, the last word or group of words has been replaced by a beep. Select the correct option to complete the recording. Recording B.
Scientists distinguish two basic ways in which we receive information from the outside world through the sense of touch: active and passive, or, to put it more simply, touching and being touched. Being touched, or passive tactile awareness, includes sensing external pressure and temperature acting on parts of the body, and this gives us clues as to the nature of our environment. Active touching is when we explore our surroundings with our hands, feet, mouth, and so on. Because it's difficult to guess what some objects are really like with the eyes alone, for example, their weight, hardness or softness, roughness or smoothness, etc., touching them gives us a much fuller understanding of the objects around us. Yet, how touch works is very complex and
Practice Test 4, page 143, Section 2. Highlight incorrect words. You will hear a recording. Below is a transcription of the recording. Some words in the transcription differ from what the speaker said. As you listen, circle the words that are different. Recording A.
When societies were still mostly rural and agricultural, waste disposal was hardly an issue, partly because people tended to make use of everything, and partly because there was plenty of space to bury rubbish. It was when societies became predominantly urban and industrial that problems arose, mainly to do with health. City authorities had a hard time trying to find efficient ways of getting rid of all the rubbish. One of these was to get people to sort out their rubbish into different types, just as these days we are encouraged to separate our rubbish into different categories for easier removal and recycling. So, for example, kitchen rubbish was set aside and used for feeding animals. However, fears of disease put an end to that. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that all waste was simply thrown together and ploughed into landfills.
Recording B.
Archery, the practice or art of shooting with a bow and arrow, has played an important part in English history, being the main weapon of the foot soldier and instrumental in winning many battles in wars with the French, with whom we seem to be constantly at war during the Middle Ages. The English favoured the long bow over the short bow and the crossbow, the latter being the main firearm of militaries on the European continent. The crossbow fired a metal bolt released by a trigger, rather like a gun, and had the longest range of any of the bows. But the main advantage of the longbow was its accuracy. The importance placed on archery is illustrated by the fact that medieval kings in England encouraged the practice, and one of them, Edward III, went so far as to ban all sports on Sundays and holidays except archery. Because there were no standing armies in those days, and in the event of war rulers had to call on the populace, everything was done to make sure there were large numbers of competent, if not expert, archers to recruit.
Practice Test 4, page 143, section 2. Write from dictation. You will hear some sentences. Write each sentence exactly as you hear it. Write as much of each sentence as you can. You will hear each sentence only once.
The field of social history has always been difficult to define.
All essays must be accompanied by a list of references.
Authoritarian regimes were more common in the past than they are today.
The new law was harder to impose than the government thought.